Welcome to Relaxing Revenge Storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight's story is a real treat.
My name is Sydney Stevens. I'm 30 years old. On the evening of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, I stood in a banquet room at Piedmont Country Club in Durham, North Carolina, and I watched my father raise a champagne glass to toast 3.5 decades of marriage. 40 guests lifted their glasses with him. Crystal caught the chandelier light. My mother pressed her hand to her heart like she might cry from happiness. And at every place, sitting around that room, tucked beside the linen napkin and the bread plate, sat an ivory envelope with a single page inside that was about to end the performance my parents had been running for 9 years. My father never finished the toast. His champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood floor, and the sound it made was the first honest thing I'd heard in that room all night. But I need to go back, way back, because what happened at that anniversary dinner didn't start with envelopes. It started with a lie told over my grandmother's body before the dirt had even settled. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you to do something. If you've ever been the person in your family who asked a question and got punished for it, if you've ever watched someone lie to a room full of people and get applauded for it, this story is going to sit in a very specific place in your chest. Hit subscribe, drop a like. And if you've got a story of your own, I want to hear it in the comments, because the thing I learned is that silence is the most expensive thing you can carry. To understand how I ended up standing in front of 40 people with a stack of envelopes, you have to go back to the summer I was 21, the summer my grandmother Helen died, and the summer my father stole my inheritance while holding my hand at the funeral. I grew up on the east side of Durham, in a house with a yard that backed up to a creek and a family that looked, from every conceivable angle, like the kind of family people envied. My father, Craig Stevens, owned a small commercial contracting business. He coached Little League, he served on the elder board at First Presbyterian. He was the guy who brought extra folding chairs to the block party, who shook your hand and remembered your kid's name, who said things at dinner like, "Family is the only investment that pays compound interest," while my mother, Diane, refilled everyone's wine and smiled like she'd married the last good man in North Carolina. My mother was the warm one. She hosted garden club. She organized the church bake sale. She showed up at my school events with cupcakes that looked like they belonged in a magazine and a laugh that made everyone in the room feel included. People loved Diane Stevens. They loved her in that specific consuming way that communities love women who appear to give endlessly without asking for anything in return. And then there was me and my sister Brooke. I was the older one by 3 years. I was the serious one, the one who studied too much, who wanted to be a veterinarian since I was 9, who got a scholarship to NC State and worked through every summer. Brooke was the easy one, the social one, the one who looked like my mother and laughed like my father and moved through the world with the kind of frictionless charm that made everything come to her a half step faster than it came to me. I love my family. I need you to understand that. I love them with the kind of unquestioning loyalty that only works when you don't look too closely at the books. My grandmother Helen was the person I was closest to in the world. She lived in a townhouse on Elm Street in Durham, a 2-bedroom with a porch swing and gardenia bushes along the front walk. Her hands always smelled like gardenia lotion. She'd press my palm flat against hers and say, "Same hands, same heart." She was a retired school teacher who had quietly, methodically, over 40 years of careful saving and smart purchases, accumulated 4 rental properties in the Triangle. Nothing flashy. A townhouse in Durham, a duplex near Chapel Hill, 2 single-family homes in Raleigh. Steady income, solid tenants. The kind of portfolio a school teacher builds when she understands compound interest and doesn't need anyone to know she understands it. Helen died in the summer of 2017 when I was 21 and had just been accepted to veterinary school. I was gutted. She was my anchor, the person who looked at me and saw exactly who I was without editing. At the funeral, my father gave a eulogy that made people weep. He talked about her strength, her generosity, her love for her granddaughters. He said, "Mom built something beautiful with those properties. She wanted her family taken care of." People in the pews nodded. My mother held my hand and squeezed it twice, which was her code for, "I love you." Within 3 months of the funeral, my parents told us the properties had been sold, all 4 of them, liquidated to cover what my father described as staggering medical debts from Grandma's last year. He sat us down at the kitchen table, Brooke and me, and his eyes were red and his voice was thick, and he said, "I wish there was something left, girls. I wish I could tell you there was an inheritance. But Mom's care wiped it out. Every last dollar. I'm sorry." I remember the silence at that table. I remember Brooke reaching for my hand. I remember my mother standing at the kitchen counter with her back to us, and I remember thinking she was crying. She wasn't crying. I know that now. She was looking out the window at the backyard where the creek ran, and she was waiting for us to accept it, which we did. Because why wouldn't we? These were our parents. They had red eyes and heavy voices, and they said there was nothing left, and we were 21 and 18, and we believed them the way you believe the people who raised you, which is completely and without the instinct to verify. I went to vet school carrying that grief, not just the grief of losing Helen, but the secondary grief of losing what she'd built, the knowledge that her decades of careful work had been consumed by medical bills in a system that devours savings. I took out loans. I worked nights at an emergency animal hospital. I graduated and opened my small animal clinic on Roxborough Road with an SBA loan for $40,000 that my parents co-signed as personal guarantors. I was grateful. I thanked them in front of relatives at Christmas dinner. My father put his arm around me and said to the room, "This girl's going to heal every dog in Durham, and her mother and I are proud to help her get there." What I did not know, what I would not know for 6 more years, was that my parents' co-signature on that loan cost them nothing and gave them everything. It gave them a leash, a $40,000 leash attached to my entire professional life, and every time I got too close to a question they didn't want to answer, they yanked it. Because here's what was actually happening while I was working 16-hour days to build a veterinary practice from nothing. My father had never sold those properties, not one. In the month after Helen's funeral, while he was still accepting casseroles from church friends and talking about the devastating medical bills, he formed a limited liability company called Stevens Family Holdings, LLC, registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State, listing himself as sole managing member and my mother Diane as registered agent. He transferred all 4 of Helen's rental properties into the LLC, and for 9 years, those properties generated rental income. $5,600 a month, $67,000 a year, $604,000 total, $604,000 that my grandmother built, that my grandmother intended for me and my sister, that my father took and buried in an account I never knew existed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because for 6 years, I didn't know any of this. For 6 years, I was the woman who worked 70-hour weeks at a small animal clinic, who drove a 12-year-old Honda, who brought her own coffee to work because the cafe across the street was a luxury she calculated against her loan payments. And at every family gathering, at every holiday, at every Sunday dinner at my parents' house, my father would tell the assembled relatives that Sydney had refused her share of the inheritance to focus on her career. That's the phrase he used. Refused her share. Like I had been offered something and turned it down out of cold ambition. Like I was the daughter who chose work over Grandma Helen's memory. And people believed it. Of course they did. Because Craig Stevens delivered the line with just the right note of sad pride, like he admired my independence even though it hurt him. And my mother would add softly, "She's so driven. She gets it from Helen." And relatives would nod and look at me with that particular expression, half respect, half pity, the look you give someone who sacrificed something important for something ambitious. I would sit at those tables and smile. I would accept the narrative, because what was the alternative? Stand up at Thanksgiving and say, "Actually, I didn't refuse anything. I was never offered anything. I was told there was nothing to offer." And have my father say, with that practiced confusion, "Sweetheart, we had this conversation. Don't you remember?" And have 30 relatives look at me like I was the difficult one, the cold one, the one who was always a little too intense, a little too focused on money, a little too much like a woman who chose career over family. That was the specific shape of the trap, not just the lie. The way the lie was dressed, the way it made me the villain in my own story while my parents played the heartbroken supporters. The way the community absorbed the narrative and reflected it back at me until I almost started to believe it myself. I'll tell you the moment I almost broke. Thanksgiving, 7 months before the anniversary dinner. My parents' house, full table, turkey and cranberry, and the smell of Diane's cornbread dressing that everyone always praised. After dinner, my mother came to where I was standing by the kitchen window. She wrapped her arms around me from behind and pressed her cheek against mine and whispered, "We would give you the whole world if we had it, baby." My throat closed. My eyes burned. I leaned back into her, and I believed her. In that second, standing in the kitchen with the smell of cornbread and the sound of family laughter in the next room, I let myself believe that my parents had given me everything they could, and there simply wasn't more. In the LLC bank records from that same November, there is a $12,000 wire transfer labeled Brooke Registry Fund, and a scanned handwritten note in my father's writing clipped to the statement. The note says, "Don't mention to Sid. She doesn't need to know what she doesn't miss." My mother hugged me. It was the warmest and most expensive lie she ever told. I want to tell you about Brooke for a moment. My younger sister had received over the years an $85,000 down payment on a house, a fully funded graduate degree, and a new car, all paid from the LLC account, all described to her as gifts my parents scraped together through sacrifice and careful budgeting. Brooke didn't know about the LLC. She didn't know about the rental income. She believed, as I did, that the properties had been sold to cover medical bills. She believed our parents were stretching to help her and that I had declined help out of pride. My parents had built two daughters into two roles. Brooke was the grateful one. I was the cold one. And neither of us knew we were performing in a play written by people who were stealing from us both. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday in March, 8 months before the anniversary dinner. A longtime client named Dana Parsons brought her golden retriever in for a hip evaluation. While I was examining the dog's range of motion, Dana mentioned offhandedly that she loved her townhouse, that the maintenance was responsive, that she'd been renting from Stevens Family Holdings LLC for 2 years, and they were great landlords. I stopped moving. My hands went ice cold the second I heard the name. My fingers were still on the dog's hip joint, and I remember the warmth of the animal's body against my suddenly frozen hands, and I said, in a voice I'm sure sounded perfectly normal, "I'm not familiar with that company. Where's the townhouse?" She told me the address, Elm Street, my grandmother's townhouse, the one with the porch swing, the one with the gardenia bushes, the one I had been told was sold in 2017 to pay medical debts. That night, after the clinic closed, I sat at my computer in the small apartment above the practice. I opened the North Carolina Secretary of State Business Database. I typed in Stevens Family Holdings LLC, and what I found in that database rewrote every memory I had of my childhood. 4 residential properties, registered under the LLC since 2017. Managing member, Craig Stevens. Registered agent, Diane Stevens. Active status, good standing. My stomach recognized the lie before my brain finished reading the information. I made it to the bathroom before I threw up. Then I sat on the tile floor with my back against the tub and I stared at the ceiling and I felt something shift inside me that has never shifted back. It was like a bone setting. Something that had been flexible, accommodating, willing to bend around my parents' version of reality went rigid and stayed that way. I pulled county property records next, tax records, assessment histories. Everything was public. Everything was right there, a few clicks from anyone who thought to look. But why would I have looked? Why would anyone search the Secretary of State database for their own family name? You don't audit the people you trust. That's what trust means. And my parents had weaponized it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk and I printed every document I could find and I laid them out on my kitchen table and I looked at 9 years of evidence that my parents had stolen my grandmother's properties, lied about their sale, collected over $600,000 in rental income, and told the entire family that I had refused my inheritance. But the county records were just the skeleton. I needed the blood. I needed bank statements, transaction records, distribution details. I needed to see where $604,000 had gone. And I needed to see Helen's original estate documents because something was nagging at me, a feeling in the back of my skull that my grandmother would not have died without leaving instructions. 2 months later, I'd understand why Maureen Pratt kept a fireproof safe in her guest bedroom. That Tuesday, I just thought she was cautious. Maureen Pratt was a CPA who had managed my family's books for 22 years. She was also Helen's college roommate, her closest friend. The woman who sat beside Helen's hospital bed in those last weeks and held her hand while my father was in the hallway making phone calls to an estate attorney about how to restructure the asset transfer. I had known Maureen my whole life. She came to birthday parties. She sent Christmas cards. She was a quiet, precise woman in reading glasses who always smelled like Earl Grey tea and who my father trusted completely with his numbers. What I did not know, what no one knew, was that Helen had given Maureen an assignment. In the last months of her life, my grandmother had asked her oldest friend to document everything, every transaction, every lie, every misdirected dollar, and to wait, to stay embedded in Craig's bookkeeping, to keep his trust, to file his taxes, to manage his accounts, and to quietly, meticulously archive every piece of evidence in a fireproof safe in her guest bedroom. and to wait until Sydney was strong enough. 2 weeks after I found the LLC records, I called Maureen. I told her what I'd discovered. There was a silence on the phone that lasted 4 full breaths. Then she said, "Can you meet me tomorrow? The cafe on 9th Street. Come alone." I sat across from her at a corner table. She was 71 years old in a blue cardigan with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She set her coffee cup down so slowly, I knew the next sentence was going to change the shape of my life. She slid a USB drive across the table, small, black, unremarkable. She looked at me and said quietly, "Your grandmother Helen asked me to wait until you were strong enough. You're strong enough now." That USB drive contained 9 years of LLC bank statements showing $604,000 in total rental income, distribution records showing where the money went, tax returns showing undisclosed LLC income, and at the bottom of the file directory, scanned in high resolution, a notarized letter from my grandmother Helen, dated 8 months before her death. The letter was addressed to the estate attorney. It stipulated in Helen's careful handwriting with a notary seal that the 4 rental properties were to be split equally between Sydney and Brooke. Equal distribution, clear language, legally binding. My father had intercepted this letter from the estate attorney and never filed it. He took his mother's last wish, the document that would have given me and Brooke our inheritance, and he buried it. Then he formed an LLC, took the properties for himself, and told the family that his own daughter had refused what was hers. I sat in that cafe, and I read the letter, and I read the bank statements, and I looked at Maureen, and she was watching me with an expression I will never forget. It was grief, and it was relief, and it was the particular look of a woman who has been carrying a promise for 9 years and has finally been able to put it down. There was more. Inside the files, clipped to a bank statement, I found a scanned handwritten note from Helen. It was addressed to Maureen. 6 words. "Maureen, protect my girls from my own son." I drove home that night with the USB drive in my jacket pocket and my hands shaking on the steering wheel and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as the weight of proof. For 6 years, I'd felt crazy. For 6 years, I'd wondered if I was the cold one, the difficult one, the daughter who somehow deserved less. And now I had 604,000 reasons why I wasn't crazy. I was the only one paying attention. In the weeks that followed, I built a case, not for a courtroom, for something more devastating. Let me explain why. Maureen and I met 3 more times. Each meeting added layers. She showed me the annual tax returns where the LLC income was reported under my father's social security number but never disclosed to the family. She showed me the distribution records, the $85,000 payment for Brooke's down payment drawn directly from the LLC account. She showed me the car purchase, the graduate school tuition, all from the LLC, all from Helen's properties. All while my parents told me they wished they could help with the clinic but just didn't have it. I charted everything on a single page. Clean, simple, undeniable. The LLC formation document with my father's signature. Helen's suppressed letter requesting equal distribution. A column of numbers showing $604,000 collected. A column showing $0 given to Sydney, and then something happened that nearly unraveled everything. Craig noticed a missing quarterly statement from Maureen's filing system. He called her. He asked pointed questions, his voice carrying that edge of authority he used when he wanted someone to feel small. Maureen told me later that her hands were shaking under her desk. She told him a software update had corrupted some of the archived files and she was rebuilding from backups. He accepted it. But the call lasted 14 minutes, and when it was over, Maureen poured herself a bourbon at 2 p.m. and sat in her living room staring at the fireproof safe and wondering if she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. She'd kept a perfect archive for 9 years. She wasn't going to lose it to a software update excuse that didn't hold under scrutiny. We accelerated the timeline. Then came Craig, directly. He discovered somehow that I had requested LLC records from the Secretary of State. Maybe an alert, maybe a contact at the office. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he showed up in the parking lot of my clinic on a Thursday evening. I was locking the front door. He was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, wearing the same disappointed father expression he'd used my entire life when he wanted me to feel small enough to stop asking questions. He said, "Sydney, I don't know what you think you're looking for, but family business stays in the family." I said nothing. I just looked at him. He stepped closer. His voice dropped, and he said the thing that, of everything he ever said to me, I will carry the longest. He said, "If you keep digging into family business, I pull the guarantor papers and your bank calls the loan in 90 days. Your clinic is done, everything you built gone, because you couldn't leave well enough alone. He stood there in the parking lot of the clinic I had built with my own hands, the clinic I stayed up until midnight running numbers for, the clinic where I treated animals because my grandmother taught me that caring for something smaller than yourself is the only real measure of character, and he threatened to destroy it. Not because I had done anything wrong, because I had found out what he did. I went upstairs to my apartment that night and I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at the USB drive on my nightstand and I understood with perfect clarity what kind of man my father was. He wasn't a father who made a mistake. He was a man who looked at his own mother's dying wish and saw an opportunity, and who looked at his own daughter's livelihood and saw a lever. The 90-day clock started in my head that night. He had given me a deadline without meaning to. I had 90 days before he could pull the guarantor. I needed to move before he did. Maureen and I strategized. We could go legal, file a challenge to the estate, get an attorney involved. But Maureen said something that changed my thinking. She said, "Your father's power isn't the money. It's the story everyone believes about him. You can sue him and win in court, and the family will still think you're the cold one who went after her own parents. You have to change the story, and you have to do it where everyone can see." She was right. Craig and Diane's power was social. They had spent 9 years curating a narrative, generous parents sacrificing for their daughters, heartbroken about the medical bills that consumed Helen's estate. Every lie was told in public, reinforced in public, maintained in public. The only way to break it was in public. My parents' 35th wedding anniversary was 6 weeks away. They were planning a dinner at Piedmont Country Club, 40 guests, church friends, business partners, Diane's garden club, and 3 of Helen's surviving friends, elderly women who had known my grandmother for decades and who still sent me cards on my birthday. 40 people, 40 witnesses, 40 people who had absorbed the narrative and needed to see the truth. That was the moment the plan took shape. Not a lawsuit, not a social media post, 40 envelopes. I need to tell you about Brooke, because what happened with my sister in those weeks before the anniversary nearly broke me in a different way than anything my parents had done. Brooke called me on a Sunday night. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She'd found a bank envelope in our parents' filing cabinet while looking for her birth certificate. The envelope was from a bank she didn't recognize, and the account number didn't match anything she knew about. She Googled the LLC name printed on the statement inside, and she found everything I had found. When she called me, she was sobbing. She said, "I Googled the LLC name and I found everything. Sid, I didn't know. I swear on my life I didn't know." I stood in my apartment with the phone pressed against my ear, and I heard my sister's voice cracking open, and for one cold surgical second I thought, my parents sent her. They figured out what I know, and they sent Brooke to cry on the phone and find out how much I've seen and report back. That thought lasted maybe 5 seconds. But I need to be honest about those 5 seconds because they tell you what living in a lying family does to your ability to trust anyone, even the people you love most. It wasn't an act. Brooke was devastated. She had received $85,000 for a down payment, a car, a graduate degree, and she had accepted it all with gratitude and guilt, believing her parents were stretching to help her, while her older sister was too proud to take help. She had performed the role of the grateful daughter while I performed the role of the cold one, and neither of us had written the script. Brooke became my fiercest ally. She insisted on returning the $85,000 to the trust. She helped me prepare. She proofread the 1-page summary that would go in each envelope. And she sat across from me at my kitchen table 2 nights before the anniversary and said, "I'm going to be at that dinner, and when you stand up, I'm standing with you." If you've ever held the truth about someone everyone else loves, if you've ever known something about a person the whole room adores, and you've carried it so long it started to feel like the truth was the problem and not the lie, I need you to hear me. You're not crazy. And if this story is landing somewhere specific in your chest right now, consider subscribing because what happens next at that dinner is why I'm telling you this. The morning of the anniversary dinner, I woke up at 5. I lay in bed in my apartment above the clinic and listened to the silence. Below me, through the floor, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the clinic's lab, the sound of the building being alive and working while the world was still dark. I had 40 ivory envelopes stacked on my kitchen table. Each one contained a single page. I'd printed them at the clinic after hours, on good paper using the laser printer I normally used for lab reports. Each page showed 3 things: the LLC formation document with my father's signature, Helen's notarized letter requesting equal distribution, and a simple chart showing $604,000 collected and $0 given to Sydney. I showered. I dressed. I chose the navy dress my grandmother had taken me to buy for my college graduation, the one Helen had said made me look like a woman who knows things. I put on earrings that had been hers, small gold studs I'd inherited only because they were in a jewelry box at Maureen's house and not in the estate my father controlled. I loaded the envelopes into a canvas tote bag. I checked my phone. There was a text from Brooke. "I'm already here, front table, I love you." And a text from Maureen. "Helen would be proud, I'll be watching." And there was a text from my mother. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Daddy's been practicing his toast all week. LOL, wear something pretty." I set the phone face down on the counter and I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The sealed envelopes were in the bag by the door. One of them, the one I'd printed last, I held in my hands. I turned it over, ivory paper, smooth, sealed. Inside was the truth about my family, reduced to a single page, and in a few hours I was going to hand one to every person my parents had ever lied to. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected trembling, nausea, the kind of physical dread that accompanies irreversible action. Instead, I felt something closer to gravity, a heaviness pulling me forward, not pulling me down. I drove to Piedmont Country Club as the sun was going orange over Durham. The club sits on a hill with old oaks and a circular drive and the kind of brick and white column architecture that communicates permanence and respectability. My parents had chosen this venue deliberately. This was where Craig closed business deals. This was where Diane hosted the Garden Club's spring luncheon. This was their stage. I parked in the back of the lot. I sat in the car for 3 minutes. I could see the ballroom through the tall windows, already lit, already arranged. I could see people moving inside, white tablecloths, candlelight, the shapes of flower arrangements. I picked up the tote bag, I got out of the car, I walked across the parking lot in my grandmother's earrings and the dress she chose for me, and I carried 40 envelopes through the front door of Piedmont Country Club. The room was beautiful. My mother had outdone herself. Round tables for 6 with ivory linens and centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. A string quartet in the corner playing something soft and classical. A bar along the back wall with champagne flutes already poured. The room smelled like lilies and warm bread and the faint citrus of whatever cologne my father was wearing. 40 guests. I scanned the room as I entered. Craig's business partners, Richard and Tom, in dark suits laughing near the bar. Diane's garden club, a cluster of women in pastels near the head table already cooing about the centerpieces. The church friends, 8 or 9 couples from First Presbyterian, people who had watched me grow up, who had seen Craig serve communion and Diane organize the food pantry. And at a table near the windows, 3 elderly women with white hair and careful postures, Helen's surviving friends, Martha, Evelyn, and Grace. Women who had played bridge with my grandmother for 30 years. Brooke was at the front table. She looked at me when I walked in and her face was pale, but her eyes were steady, and she gave me the smallest nod I've ever seen. I had to place the envelopes. That was the part I had planned most carefully. I'd arrived 30 minutes before the dinner was called, during the cocktail hour when people were standing circulating, drinking. I moved through the room with the tote bag and I set an ivory envelope at every place setting, tucked between the napkin and the bread plate, as if it were a party favor, a thank you note, one of those little extras that Diane Stevens was known for including. No one questioned it. A few people saw me doing it and smiled. One of Diane's garden club friends said, "Oh, how lovely. Is this from your parents?" And I said, "It's something I put together," and she patted my arm and moved on. It took me 12 minutes to place all 40 envelopes. When I was done, I sat down on my assigned seat next to Brooke, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited. Dinner was served. Salad, rolls, a chicken entree with herb butter that I couldn't taste, small talk around the tables about the weather, about the club's new pool renovation, about someone's grandchild starting kindergarten. Normal, pleasant, unremarkable conversation. The social surface of a community that believed it knew everyone at the table. My father circulated. He shook hands. He clapped shoulders. He made eye contact with the ease of a man who has practiced sincerity until it's indistinguishable from the real thing. He stopped at Helen's friend's table and bent down and said something that made Martha laugh and Evelyn reach for his hand. I watched him hold Evelyn's hand for a moment, this 80-year-old woman who had loved his mother, and I watched him smile at her with perfect warmth while wearing a suit that was paid for with money he stole from his mother's estate. My mother moved through the room like light. She thanked everyone for coming. She touched arms and laughed and teared up at the right moments and said things like, 35 years, and he still makes me coffee every morning. and the room sighed with collective affection for this beautiful marriage. I ate nothing. I drank water. Brooke's knee was pressed against mine under the table, and neither of us moved it. After the entree plates were cleared, my father stood. He tapped his champagne glass with a fork, and the string quartet faded, and the room turned toward him. He was standing at the head table, next to my mother, and the candlelight was catching his silver hair, and the room was warm and quiet and waiting. 35 years ago, he began, and his voice had that practice break in it, the one he used at funerals and baptisms and any public moment that required tenderness. I married the most extraordinary woman I've ever known, and every year since, she has made me a better man. The room made a collective sound, that soft exhale of an audience receiving a sentiment they want to believe. He talked about their early years, about the house they built, about raising 2 incredible daughters. He looked at Brooke and me, and his eyes glistened, and he said, "Sydney and Brooke, you are your mother's greatest achievement and my greatest pride." I held his gaze. My face was composed. My hands were still folded in my lap. He raised his glass. "To Diane," he said. "To 35 years of building something beautiful together. To family. To trust." 40 glasses rose. The word trust hung in the air like a chandelier about to fall. I stood up. The movement was slow enough that it didn't immediately register as unusual. A few people glanced over. Brooke's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once and let go. "I'd like to add something," I said. My voice was level. It came from somewhere lower in my chest than I normally speak. "If that's all right." My father's face showed a flicker, the briefest contraction around his eyes, but he recovered instantly and smiled and gestured toward me with his glass. "Of course, sweetheart. The floor is yours." I stepped away from my chair. I moved to the center of the room, between the tables where everyone could see me. I was aware of every face turning toward me. I was aware of the string quartet's silence, the clink of ice in someone's glass, the smell of lilies, and the warmth of 40 bodies in a candlelit room. "I want to thank my parents," I said, "for teaching me the true value of family trust." The room smiled. My mother pressed her hand to her heart again. "I've prepared something for each of you," I continued. "You'll find an envelope at your place setting. I'd like to ask you to open it now." 40 hands reached for ivory envelopes. The sound of paper tearing, of seals being broken, was like a small rainstorm moving through the room. I watched it travel from table to table. I watched the first envelope open at Craig's business partner's table. I watched Richard pull out the single page and unfold it. I watched his eyes move from left to right and then stop and then go back to the beginning and start again. The room changed in waves. It was like watching a stone drop into still water and the ripples moving outward. Table by table, face by face, the social surface of the room cracked and what was underneath came through. I spoke into the growing silence. "What you're looking at is a summary of a limited liability company called Stevens Family Holdings, formed by my father, Craig Stevens, in 2017, 3 months after my grandmother Helen's death. You'll see that the 4 rental properties my family was told were sold to cover medical debts were in fact transferred into this LLC and have been generating rental income for 9 years. $604,000 to be exact. You'll also see a notarized letter from my grandmother, written 8 months before she died, stipulating that those properties be split equally between me and my sister Brooke. My father intercepted this letter from the estate attorney and never filed it. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of 40 people revising every assumption they had ever made about the man standing at the head table with a champagne glass that was now trembling in his hand. I watched my father's face. I watched it in stages. First, the smile that was still on his face from his toast, frozen there, no longer connected to anything happening behind it. Then the smile dying, collapsing inward, the muscles around his mouth going slack. Then the color leaving his skin, starting at his forehead and moving down like a tide going out. Then his eyes finding mine, and in them, something I had never seen from my father. Fear. His champagne glass slipped from his hand. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, and the sound was sharp and final, and no one moved to clean it up. My mother's reaction was faster. Diane was on her feet before the glass hit the ground, moving between tables, reaching for envelopes. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice bright and brittle and carrying the particular energy of a woman who has controlled a room her entire life and is feeling that control evaporate. "Sydney has been under a lot of stress. Please give me those. This isn't the time or place." But the room had already read the page. The room had already seen the LLC formation with Craig's signature. The room had already seen Helen's letter. The room had already done the math. No one gave Diane their envelope. Martha, Helen's oldest friend, was the one who broke the silence. She was 83 years old. She was sitting at the window table with Evelyn and Grace, and she had put on her reading glasses to look at the page, and now she took them off and set them down on the tablecloth with a precision that commanded the room's attention. "Craig," she said. Her voice was clear and thin, and it carried the authority of a woman who had known his mother for 50 years. "Helen told me about the letter. She told me she wrote it. I asked you at the funeral if Helen had left instructions about the properties. You told me she hadn't." The room turned to Craig, every head, every pair of eyes. Craig opened his mouth. What came out was not the polished voice that had delivered the toast. It was smaller, damaged, the voice of a man whose instrument has been broken. "Martha, there's context here that Sydney doesn't understand. The finances were complicated. Mom's care was expensive, and we had to make decisions." $604,000 in decisions? Richard, his business partner, said it, not loudly, almost conversationally, but the number landed in the room like a brick through glass. "That's not..." Craig looked at Diane. Diane was standing between two tables with an envelope in each hand, and she was looking at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother's performance fail. Her face was doing something it didn't know how to do. It was showing the truth. And the truth was that she knew. She had always known. She was the registered agent. Her name was on the documents the room was holding. The medical bills, Craig started again, were $42,000. Maureen's voice came from the doorway. I hadn't seen her enter. She was standing just inside the room in her blue cardigan, with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she spoke with the quiet certainty of a woman who has been keeping the books for 22 years. "I processed them. Helen's insurance covered most of it. The family paid $42,000 out of pocket, not $600,000. 42. The room did the math. You could watch them do it. $604,000 collected, $42,000 in medical bills. The gap was the lie, and the lie was enormous, and it was sitting in the room with all of them now. Craig's closest friend from church, a man named David, who had served with him on the elder board for 15 years, was sitting at the table nearest the head table. He had his envelope open in front of him. He was looking at the page, and then he looked up at Craig, and his expression was the one that hurt my father the most, I think, because it wasn't anger, it was recognition. The look of a man realizing he has been performing friendship with a stranger. David didn't say anything. He folded the page carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table and looked at his hands. That was worse than any words. Grace, Helen's friend, was crying quietly. Evelyn had her arm around her. Martha was still looking at Craig with those clear, judging eyes. Diane made one more attempt. She turned to me with an expression that was half pleading and half fury, and she said, "Sydney, you are destroying this family." I looked at my mother. I looked at her standing in the room she had decorated, in the dress she had chosen, surrounded by the people she had cultivated for decades, and I said the truest thing I have ever said. "No, Mom, I'm just showing everyone what it actually looks like." The room was silent. The candles were still burning. The white roses were still perfect in their arrangements. The string quartet's instruments sat empty on their stands. And everywhere, on every table, ivory envelopes lay open, the truth released into air that could never be resealed. I looked at Brooke. She was standing now too, tears running down her face, and she nodded at me, and the nod said everything. I picked up my bag. I walked past my father, who was standing beside his chair with broken glass at his feet and a face I did not recognize because I'd never seen it without the mask. I walked past my mother, who was holding two envelopes and looking at the room like a woman watching her house burn from the inside. I walked through the ballroom of Piedmont Country Club and through the lobby and out the front doors into the June evening, and the air hit my skin, and it was warm, and it smelled like cut grass, and I breathed it in like a woman coming up from deep water. Brooke caught up with me in the parking lot. She didn't say anything. She just walked next to me to my car, and we stood there in the dark, and she put her head on my shoulder, and we listened to the crickets and the distant sound of the string quartet starting up again inside, because someone apparently decided the music should play even though the party was over. What happened in the 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner was not something I orchestrated. That's what I want to be clear about. I distributed 40 envelopes. I presented facts. I did not call anyone. I did not post anything online. I did not file a lawsuit. I let the truth sit in 40 people's hands, and I let the community decide what to do with it. The community decided. Within the first week, Craig received a call from the chair of the elder board at First Presbyterian asking him to resign. The conversation was brief. The chair said, "Craig, in light of what's come to our attention, we think it's best if you step down. This isn't punitive, it's pastoral." Craig argued. He said the information was taken out of context. He said his daughter had emotional issues. The chair said, "We've seen the documents, Craig. Helen's letter is notarized." Craig resigned the next day. Richard and Tom, his business partners, quietly dissolved a pending joint venture. They didn't make a scene. They didn't send a letter. They simply stopped returning Craig's calls about the project, and when he finally reached Richard, Richard said, "I think we need to go in different directions on this one, Craig." The deal was worth $120,000. It evaporated in a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. Diane's garden club president, a woman named Patricia who had coordinated spring plantings with my mother for 12 years, called and said, "Diane, we think it's best you take a break this season." My mother, I was told later, tried to laugh it off. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that Sydney was going through a difficult time, that family matters were being blown out of proportion. Patricia said, "The letter from Helen was quite clear, Diane. We'll save your spot for next year." She did not call back the next year. 4 family members who had loaned Craig money over the years, loans he had described as necessary during tight times, now demanded repayment. They had seen the LLC bank statements showing $67,000 a year in rental income flowing into an account my father controlled. The loans, they realized, had never been necessary. Craig had borrowed money he didn't need from relatives who trusted him while sitting on more than $500,000 in property income. The calls to me started in the second week. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years, church friends who had watched me grow up, people who said variations of the same thing. "Sydney, I always felt something was off. Sydney, I'm sorry I didn't see it. Sydney, your grandmother would be so proud of you." I listened to each call, I accepted each apology, and I noticed, with a feeling that was more tired than bitter, that every single person who said I always knew something was off had never once in 9 years asked a single question. The suspicion had existed. It had just been more comfortable to leave it unexamined. Craig attempted damage control. He called guests individually. He told different versions to different people. The properties were held in trust for the girls. The timing wasn't right for distribution. There were tax complications. Sydney misunderstood the legal structure. Each version contradicted the last. Each call spread the story further instead of containing it. By the third week, Craig's attempts to explain had done more damage than the envelopes themselves because people compared notes. Richard told Tom what Craig had told him, and it didn't match what Craig had told Tom, and both of them told David from church, and David said, "He told me a 4th version." The lie fractured into smaller lies, and the smaller lies contradicted each other, and the contradiction was its own proof. A man telling the truth tells one story. My father told 6. The key object, the thing I keep coming back to, is the envelope. It started as Helen's notarized letter, sealed and suppressed by my father, hidden from the estate process, buried so thoroughly that it might never have surfaced if Dana Parsons hadn't mentioned her landlord's name while I examined her dog's hip. It became 40 ivory envelopes placed at 40 dinner settings, the truth distributed like a party favor. And now one sits on my desk at the clinic, unsealed, empty. I keep it in my drawer, blank inside, for the day I'm ready to write my own letter to my own future family. The envelope that can't be resealed because once truth is opened, it stays open. Maureen and I had dinner a week after the anniversary. She brought a bottle of wine and a small box. Inside the box was Helen's handwritten note, the original, the one that said, "Maureen, protect my girls from my own son." She had kept it in the fireproof safe for 9 years. She gave it to me and said, "Your grandmother was the most clear-eyed woman I ever knew. She loved Craig, but she saw him. And she chose to protect you from what she saw." I held the note. Helen's handwriting, small and precise, the handwriting of a schoolteacher who believed in getting things right. I pressed my thumb against the paper and felt the slight indentation of the pen, and thought about my grandmother sitting in her townhouse on Elm Street, gardenia lotion on her hands, writing these words and the knowledge that her own son could not be trusted with her own legacy. Same hands, same heart. Brooke began the process of returning the $85,000. She worked with a lawyer to structure it as a repayment to what she called Grandma's Trust, a fund she and I established to manage the rental properties once we secured legal control. It took months. It is still ongoing. But Brooke's insistence on returning money she received in good faith, money she could have kept without anyone blaming her, is the act that tells me my sister's character was never built by our parents. It was built despite them. Time passed, the seasons shifted, the clinic went on. I treated dogs and cats and the occasional rabbit. I renewed the SBA loan on my own without guarantors because my credit was solid and my business was sound, and I no longer needed my parents' name on anything. I drove past Helen's townhouse on Elm Street on a Tuesday evening in October. The porch light was on. A young family I didn't know was having dinner on the patio, a woman and a man and a toddler in a high chair, and the toddler was banging a spoon on the tray and laughing, and the woman was laughing too, and the porch light made everything golden. I parked across the street and sat in my car and watched them for a few minutes. I remembered my grandmother's hands, the gardenia smell, the way she'd press my palm flat against hers. Same hands, same heart. I whispered, "I found everything, Grandma." And I sat there with the ache of her missing voice, the voice I will never hear again, and I let the ache be what it was without the lie sitting on top of it. The grief was cleaner now, not smaller, cleaner. Grief without deception is just love with nowhere to go. Grief with deception on top of it is a prison. I drove to the clinic. I went upstairs to my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table where 40 envelopes had been stacked 8 weeks earlier, and the table was bare, and the apartment was quiet, and the silence felt different from every silence that had come before it. It was not the silence of something hidden. It was the silence of something finished. I keep the empty envelope in my desk drawer. I look at it sometimes between appointments, between the lab with the ear infection and the tabby with the kidney issue, between the ordinary moments of a working life that I built with my own hands. The envelope is blank inside. It's waiting for whatever I decide to put in it. No one else's words, no one else's lies, just whatever I choose to write when I'm ready to whoever comes after me. I used to believe that family loyalty meant accepting the story you were given. I was wrong. Family loyalty means telling the truth even when the truth costs you the family. I used to believe that the people who loved you would never steal from you. I was wrong about that too. Love and honesty are different things. You can have one without the other for years, for decades, for a lifetime, and the distance between them is where the damage lives. If your parents ever made you feel crazy for asking a simple question about money, you weren't crazy. You were the only one paying attention, and the question they punished you for asking was the one they were most afraid to answer. That's the story. 1 veterinarian, 1 fireproof safe, and 40 ivory envelopes. If there's a question your family still won't answer, the one that makes the room go quiet or makes someone change the subject or makes you feel like you're being difficult for bringing it up, drop it in the comments. Because the thing I learned is that the question they don't want you to ask is the one that matters most. Subscribe if this landed. Share it with someone who